All right. Well, before we jump into it, let me just introduce myself. Most of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Austin. Um, Fishing has been part of my life since I was born. A lot of us are kind of in that same boat, and lakes were always a little bit a part of that equation too. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that it really started to take over. Like I remember the first time I was successful with a lake, I picked up a sinking line from Angler's Den on clearance, took a kayak out onto the lake I've been going to my whole life, and just caught fish every single cast. Went back the next night, same thing, same place, and didn't catch a dang thing. So I think it was that second night that really was like, all right, I'm going to do this the rest of my life. And I'm grateful I did and got involved in it because it definitely exposed a lot of the weaknesses in my river angling skills as well, because a lot of it is so transferable. And then also later in life, when I got married and started a family, lakes are the perfect opportunity to get the family out there. It's a lot easier than navigating or some of your favorite rivers and streams. You can set up a little day camp, all that. So it's all around, I think it's a great idea. If you're into it kind of and want to get into it more, awesome. If you've never even considered it, even better. We have a lot of great resources in this chapter, a lot of very knowledgeable people. So I'm by no means an expert. Like I said, I've only been doing this about 10 years. I'm here to share what I've learned, but I hope that those of you who have something to share and offer will chime in too and kind of make this more of a discussion than a full-on presentation. Um, if I had to break down the main difference between the two, I would say obviously in a river, you have your fish mostly holding still. There are exceptions to that, and the water is moving and kind of bringing the food to them, right? Well, in lakes, the water isn't moving like that. It's still moving, just in a different way. But most of the time, the fish are the ones moving, looking for that food. So, what this means is if you are knowledgeable in your approach and you really can figure out how to key on these fish, you have the opportunity to catch a lot of fish because you're always kind of presenting to new groups as they come through. They will hold an area somewhat to a degree, but for the most part, you are looking for those moving fish. Okay, before we jump into the real exciting stuff like tactics, let's go over the things you might need. I think it's important to point out that whatever gear you have, if you have a 9 foot 5 weight, a floating line, and a box of river nymphs, you can still be very successful on a lake. But if you want to take it to the next level, some of the things you'll want to consider is longer rod. I generally don't go any shorter than 9.5 feet, and I'll go up to 11 feet. Usually those are like switch rods. That's in very unique circumstances. But the reasons for that, on lakes, you're usually obstructed from behind, but you also have really, really long leaders a lot of the time if you're using a floating line. So roll casting is going to be your primary method. That little bit of extra length really helps with that. It also lets you pick up more line off the water so you can make amends at distance. Because if you've gone through all that effort to be able to cast your flies out as far as you need them to be, you want them to stay out there. You want to be able to mend and not be pulling them back into you too much. Setting the hook's a big one too, because again, you have all that line out. So when you lift up that rod, it just brings out that much more splash. When you're making those casts, that longer rod helps you have a more open loop. Again, we're not doing too many back casts anyways, but if you are, and you're using a shorter rod, that loop is going to be tighter, longer, thinner leaders, multiple flies, weight, bobbers, that's all more prone to tangling. So that helps a lot. And then this next one, this is kind of more for a boat situation, but it does help them short. In a boat, you might have two anchors, you might have a fish sounder in the water. So if you have the ability to have that little bit of extra reach to guide that fish away from danger and obstructions, you're going to be very glad you did. It also helps with wind. So that's on the rod section. For reels, there's not too much difference there. Everyone likes large arbor reels. You may be actually using your reel for its intended purpose a lot more on a lake, just because you have a chance at bigger fish. So I usually recommend upping the amount of backing you have if you don't already. And then another thing to consider is on a lake, if you're a dedicated stillwater angler or someone who maybe does this for a living, it's not uncommon to have upwards of 50 different types of fly lines and spools and reels on you in your pit bag. So if you're going to go that route, you want to make sure you have a really good interchangeable spool system. A lot of these Stillwater reels, they'll actually have plastic cassettes built in, and those cassettes are only about $20, and they are a lot lighter than an aluminum reel. So that's one thing you consider there. Okay, so jumping into fly lines a little bit more, and I do have some visual aids here to help with that. So in order to understand why you need to change your fly line, it's important that we understand what is actually going on with a fly line. The whole concept of fly fishing and fly lines in general is that mass moves mass. You don't have a 1/4 ounce jig on the end like you do with conventional gear that is driving your fly out there. Your flies almost weigh nothing, so the weight that you're throwing is actually built into that fly line. A lot of river and stream anglers, they have really compact, what we call the taper of the line, or the part that actually has the body. They'll compact that into a lot shorter section if you're a river and stream angler, especially if you're fishing streamers, because you'll strip that in close to your rod tip, and then you can pick up, and in one recast, you can shoot all that line out. Now, what that does really poorly on that short of an overall taper is that does not allow you to pick up a lot of line off the water, and it does not allow you to roll cast at any sort of significant distance. You're going to get that collapse in your line. So I like to point out that for a floating line, you want something with a long overall taper report, upwards of 60 feet from tip to running line. But the most important part is you want that rear taper, the portion that goes down from the main belly down to the running line. You want that to be long. That's usually about 20 or 30 feet in a lot of these lines. So like this line here, I have the overall taper diagram, and we can pass this around. This happens to be for the Scientific Anglers Anadrome taper. That's what I have the most experience with, is Scientific Anglers line. So you'll see in this diagram that the rear taper, the portion that tapers down, is very long. The front taper is almost blunt. It almost stops abruptly. What that front taper does is that turns over your fly quickly. So that just gets your long leader, all that weight right at the end of your cast to really flip over nicely. That long taper allows you to manage it. Sometimes we will use gadget lines. So like I mentioned, switch rods, those sorts of things. I didn't set up one of those here today. That's become a very popular method out at Pyramid Lake, because what those do is they allow you to use both hands, do a roll cast, and you can shoot a lot of line, or you can cast a normal amount of line in extremely heavy winds. It's fun, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of a lot of work. So whenever I can get by with the single hand method, I'll try to do that. For sinking lines, this is the whole beast in and of itself. You could have multiple demonstrations here just on these. But you really do need a full array of these if you want to be as effective as possible. So the main factors in determining what type of sinking line you're going to use is how deep you want your flies, of course, but also how quickly do you want to be able to retrieve those flies. If you're using a line that doesn't sink very quickly, or even a floating line for that matter, and you try to move your flies quickly, they're just going to rise in the water, ride it back up to the top. But if you have like a type 5 or a type 7 sinking line, that means it sinks anywhere from 5 to 7 inches per second. You can strip those very fast and aggressively, and they're going to stay in that spot. They may even continue to sink depending on how heavy they are or how fast you're stripping them. So obviously those full sinks, they're going to be best for your deep water and faster trees. Then there's another type of line. Actually, let me cast or move these around first. So this is a clear intermediate. It's a hover line. What this does is it sinks very slowly, but it does sink. It'll sink anywhere from like 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches per second. So when you want to fish shallow, and when you want to be able to fish your fly slowly and have them still stay in the strike zone, that doesn't mean you have to be fishing shallow water. Sometimes fish will be out in open water, 80, 90 feet deep, and they're feeding in the top 3 feet of the water column. And I think something that shocks people a lot is how difficult it can be to catch fish on dry flies out in lakes. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is so much bug life going on beneath the surface that they don't need to take that extra risk most of the time to expose themselves to predators from above like that. They're very, very spooky, I guess you could say. So fly lines that sit on the surface, that cast shadows, those are things that are going to spook them. This gets just below the surface. It blends in, it's not casting that shadow. In fact, even though this is a sinking line, one of my favorite things to do with it is to fish like a dry dropper method, where I'll actually have my dry fly out on the very end. furthest away from me. And then in between that dry fly and my fly line, I might have multiple droppers dropping off of that. And then the added benefit of that is just strike detection. So you're stripping that in and you get that immediate feedback when the fish takes it and they've already set themselves on the hook. We'll get more into all these a little bit later on, where I have actual slides with diagrams that you can.
Awesome, that technique you were just talking about, is that the washing?
Yeah, that would be the washing line method. And you can do that with full sinking lines too. And they'll a lot of the time use buoyant flies like a fab or a booby on the end to help keep your line up off the bottom. But it's deadly with that. People will even do it with floating lines too. Again, the benefit there is just that direct connection. You're slowly stripping them in. So as soon as anything takes any of those flies, you feel it right away as if you were stripping streamers. Okay, this third one down, parabolic sweep. This is kind of a weird one, and it's not necessarily new, but it's become popular a lot lately. So with these sinking lines, you'll see lines that have, they'll call them like triple density or dual density or something, where different sections of the line have different sink rates. Those sections we talked about earlier, the front taper, the belly, and the rear taper. So with a sweep line in particular, what's happening here is the front section sinks at a moderate rate, maybe 3 to 5 inches per section or per second. The belly sinks faster, maybe 7, even 9 inches per second. The running line sinks the slowest, like an intermediate line. So you'll get this parabolic kind of sag in the belly. It's very effective when you're kind of trying to figure out where the fish are, especially if you're fishing deep open water, because in one single cast, you can fish 30 feet of the water column with that sweep. Another way it's really effective, and you'll see that in this diagram here, is if you're a boat angler and you're casting back towards shore, and that shore is sloping off back towards you. Because then your flies are just going to kind of dive and follow that contour and all the way down. In that case, I would like to use some sort of buoyant fly, because that's going to make sure that your fly line could be sitting right on the bottom, but your flies are lifted just off the bottom, maybe in the first 6 to 10 inches. So even though the depth is changing, your flies are staying right near the bottom. Okay, and then sink tips. Again, we'll get into this more. I like those most from shore. In fact, it's really hard to fish a full sinking line from shore, because right next to you, that first 10 to 20 feet, there's generally lots of obstructions, whether that's rocks or weeds or whatever. So by the time you get your fly into where you need to start to recast, your fly line might be underneath some rocks and you just get snagged. So what that floating line allows you to do, or that floating line with the sink tip, is to keep all that out away from those obstructions. Then as you get them more near you, then you can pick up and recast. Again, this is kind of just an introduction to what we're going to dive more into here in a second.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
So on the sink tip, tell me, mine is still set up for when I fish pyramid. That's my knife rod and reel. But my friend set it up to fish pyramid, and I have it still set up for there because I won't know how to do it again. Where else can I fish from shore with that?
So is yours a setup where the running line is floating and then the tip is sinking? Yeah, really. I mean, I always think of Lost Creek because that's one of my favorite places around here to go fish from shore. Rocky shores, because you can cast straight out from you, or you can kind of quarter and cast a little more parallel to shore. And if the area you're targeting is 15 feet deep or so, you can get those flies there. You can strip them back towards you real fast. And then once it gets close to you, where you're thinking, okay, I'm about to get hung up on the bottom, you can just lift up your rod at that point. And those flies are then going to come up to the surface.
That ready to get one or whatever you need to put it down.
Yeah, if you wanted to switch to a different method.
Or if you want a good reason to buy one schools.
Yeah.
Well,
why is that school? Little Bill's the great spot.
Yeah, for sure. Sink tips from the float tube out there are killer.
So basically, we need Stillwater.
Yeah. I think oh, well, from the shore, yeah, you might be. So it can be kind of difficult to roll cast the sink tip depending on the type you have. So if you're fishing from shore on a river like a green or something, where you might not be able to get a full back cast behind you, especially if you have a 20 or 30 foot sink tip, whatever it may be. Yeah, it can be kind of tough because your first few rolls, yeah. But another great one for that is just trolling from a boat or two also speak to. Okay, this is probably the most important discussion we'll have. And once we get done with all this technical gear stuff, we'll get into the more fun aspect of it. So again, I've broken up the leaders into floating line versus sinking line because they're very different, but they do have some similarities as well. So on your floating line, we're using a lot of long leaders and they are a lot thinner than what we'll generally use on a sinking line. So 10 to 20 feet or even more is not unheard of to be casting from a floating line from where your fly line ends to where your bottom fly is. And what I like to do, and I guess this is a good point to kind of pass this around. Regardless of what method I'm fishing, I'm almost always tying my flies off of droppers. I hardly ever will tie to the bend of the previous fly. I mean, yeah, it does kind of help with action and stuff for sure, but the main reason I like that is because I can change any of these flies without affecting the other. Whereas if you're tying off the bend of the hook and you want to change your top fly, you got to remove that bottom piece and tie it back on. And if you're fishing 10 to 20 feet and it's allowed in the area, you could be fishing 3-4 flies and have them spaced out 3 feet apart. And you could just have whatever dropper system you have in place. I happen to really like micro swivels. You see that here, just spaced out evenly. Then you can easily remove those. So let's say you start with a 20-foot leader, but you found the fish are only eating in 6 feet. Remove a couple of those 3-foot sections and you have a much more manageable system to use.
There's a freaking fly on there. Some little thingy that you don't have to tie the fly on.
Oh, little quick flips.
I've never seen that.
Yeah, I've actually been using those not very long, and I've liked them a lot
That is smart.
for bigger flies. Yeah, it's especially on sinking lines, because on sinking lines you can kind of get away with murder as far as your presentation goes. Super thick tippet, whatever. Little,
It's not stays on, it doesn't.
yeah, and so every time I get like these swivels or whatever, I always test them. I have found some that aren't true to what the strength rating is. And those ones I hooked up a 35-pound weight to and lifted them up. And
What's that called again?
those ones are some sort of quick flip. I should have brought the case, but they came in the same package from the same manufacturer that I get my micro swivels from. And I've tested them all, and you're going to break your tippet per leader before you break one of those. Kind of a funny thing, before I switched to these really small swivels, I just got the smallest barrel swivels I could find at Sportsman's or whatever. And I can't tell you how many times I saw fish right at my feet eating those. And not caring about my flies, your bottle removed, and there'd be nothing there. And then I actually visually observed it. So I switched to something smaller. I'm sure it still happens. It's kind of a funny thing to think of. Did that already get faster?
This is it, yeah.
All right. Okay, we are almost never using any sort of tapered leader with any of these. It is still important to have a thicker butt section because that just aids in the energy transfer of that loop being able to unfurl from your thick fly line to your thin leader. If that happened abruptly, it would just collapse at that point and be a tangled mess. So I'll still do a butt section, but it's only like 2, maybe 3 feet long of 25 or 30 pound maxima or something like that. And then I'll tie a tippet ring off of that. Then from that point down to my first fly, I will have I'll have a level leader. So whether I'm using 10 pound or 12 pound, whatever it is, it'll be that same length all the way down. The reason being is if you have a tapered leader, the thicker sections are going to sink slower and the thinner sections are going to sink faster, create kind of that parabola shape. That just puts you out of connection with the fish. You're not going to see as many strikes. But if it's all level, you're going to get a really good hinge method. It's all going to sink in one straight uniform method. And then swivels, tippet rings, we already talked about that. Some people are formed, some people would rather just tie your clinch knot or blood knot or double sturgeons, whatever works best for you. I just like those because I can change and manipulate any part of my leader setup without affecting anything. Fluorocarbon most of the time still. Benefits there is it's stiff, it's not as supple. so those straight lines as it's sinking will form a lot easier. They're denser, so again, they're sinking better and they're a little bit more abrasion resistant. So now thinking line meters, that's kind of going around already. The main thing there is they're a lot shorter. I typically try to keep mine 5 to 6 feet. If I am fishing a washing line method, like with that intermediate line, I will space them out longer if I want to have multiple flies. And again, they're thicker. Sometimes no butt section at all is needed. Level leaders, swivel tip rings, fluorocarbon.
Awesome, when you say long meters, I'm putting, sorry.
Yeah.
If you already said this. Is that your full leader or are you talking leader plus the food?
That's the whole setup from fly to fly.
Okay.
And there are times I'll go more than that. Like if I'm out on a float tube and I don't really have to cast far, but the fish are 30 feet below me and I want to fish them with an indicator. Normally I do a different method that we'll talk about in a minute, but yeah, that still works. And again, that's kind of leading into what I'm going to talk about here in the next slide. So we'll just move on, unless there's more questions on this. Anything so far, rods, reels, lines, leaders. Okay. Okay, a little bit additional gear, and then I promise we're done with the gear. I try not to get too carried away with this because it helps a lot, but it's really not that important. You can go out with what you have and be successful. Indicators, fixed versus slip or quick release. Fixed indicators are really nice because you don't have to reset them every time you catch a fish. You know where that depth is at. But if you're fishing anything more than 15 feet between your indicator and your fly, you're not going to be able to strip in enough line to effectively get that fish into the net. So that's when you'll incorporate a slip or a quick release indicator. And when used correctly, these things are awesome. So I'm just going to kind of show you what this does if you haven't seen them before and how to use it, and I'll pass it around. Okay, so basically it's a two-part indicator system. You have the peg, and then you have the little foam piece, and both of them have the line running through them. You find the depth you want to fish at, you pull them apart, you pinch this top part, then you push them back together, it forms a little loop, and now it's set at depth. The fish comes along, takes your fly, you set the hook, now it's released. So it slides all the way down to wherever your first swivel is there. They can be kind of a love-hate relationship. Sometimes they disengage when you're casting or you screw something up and it pops. Or sometimes the fish are fishing at a very specific depth and you kind of are trying to mark your line or visually gauge where it is after you catch a fish to get that back to the right area. So again, I implement these when I have to, but I'm a really big fan of the fixed indicators too. There's multiple kinds out there, whatever you prefer. Pass that around, you kind of mess with that. If you haven't seen, if you don't really understand how I did it, Craig can show Aaron and Aaron can, and then you can go down the line. Or if you have any questions, let me know. All right, throat samples is a little bit of a controversial topic with a lot of anglers. It's starting to become a lot more popular on rivers and streams. I don't really know how I feel about that. I think the biggest thing with this is you want the fish to be comfortable. So what I do is I have a floating net. So that way both my hands are free. I can keep the fish completely submerged while I'm doing this. They never breathe air, keep them comfortable. On rivers, I don't know how possible that is in some scenarios. And I also think in rivers, you have a better ability to sample bugs from rocks or whatever than you might on a lake where you're fishing 30 feet down. But if done right, there's nothing wrong with it. The fish do not mind, other than they got to go now work harder to take the food that you just stole from them. I'll pass this around. I will describe how I do it again a little later on. It's a very simple process. It sucks the food out of their throat, not their stomach. You're only inserting it a few inches. And then you squirt it back into a vial or into your hand or whatever, and you can observe it. Basically, you're looking for live bugs. If it's old, decaying bugs, they ate those yesterday or whatever, it's probably not going to do you a whole lot of good. I have not seen fish tear at all, especially if you keep them submerged. I have had one fish, I was doing it and he decided to flip and it threw my throat sample like 30 feet. So I had to pull anchors, go over and get it. It was just crazy. That's the only time I've ever had anything go wrong. But that brings up a good point. If you're kind of nervous about this is what I did. I did it on fish I was planning on harvesting until I got comfortable with it. So I was going to keep those fish anyway. I started practicing that way because there's a little bit of nuance to it. You're not quite sure if you're putting it in far enough, too far, all of that. It's kind of got to get a feel for it. It's just a expensive turkey base, really. Okay, this one's kind of funny, but I'm dead serious on this. Binoculars, have them in your bag. Because if you're not casting anything and someone else is, you gotta sign off. I first started doing this at Pyramid Lake because if you're not casting fish somewhere, you can get to a vantage point and you can look for 3 miles and see 300 angles. And you'll be scanning the shoreline and then you'll say, oh, hey, look, that beach, there's 5 people in a row and they're all hooked up at once. I wonder what they're doing. Or it might just be their location. But if it is what they're doing, there's a few ways to kind of figure that out, even though you can't see what flag they have on. You can see if there's an indicator pretty easily. So you can get a sense for, okay, they're fishing indicators. I'm not. They're probably fishing midges or whatever it may be. The biggest one for me is counting down how long between casts for them if they're stripping and retrieving flies. So if they're casting and then 10 seconds later they're casting again, I know I'm gonna have to strip faster, and that might make the difference. If they're taking a minute or two between casts, they're probably just barely crawling, twitching those flies. And honestly, I always have them on me anyways. You can see some cool wildlife or something too. I kind of already talked about the net. You want a long handle floating net because you have these longer leaders, these longer rods, and you need that little extra reach just to get you the fish into the net. That floating net, especially from a boat, it keeps those hands free. So if you're taking pictures or doing a throat sample, you can have both hands on the fish and the net's right there. No harm, no foul. Depth sounders. This isn't just from both. I use a little castable one. You've probably seen those. And it just broadcasts to your phone through Wi-Fi. Castable, but what I actually do is I keep it rigged to some 20-pound mono on a bait casting reel. I open the spool and I chuck it out because I'm not ever going to be able to cast my fly line further than I can throw that thing anyways. It's not only just to find fish. In fact, I hardly ever mark fish on mine from shore. It just helps you see where the bottom is. Maybe you find some fish, maybe you don't, but it tells you the water surface temperature. A lot of them have a built-in mapping technique, so it will build that bathymetric map of where you're fishing over time. So then you can go back in and look at it. After a few outings, you'll have a bunch of the lake already mapped, so you can see those areas. You can also, I've done this before and it works really well. If you're fishing in the warmer months, and you want to see where that thermocline is or the algae buildups, we'll get into that in a minute. But you can actually see those density changes with that water, and you can pinpoint where that thermocline is, because it's going to change in various parts of the lake. So if you're fishing a lake where it's very dependent on the thermocline, that's an invaluable tool to have, because you're probably never going to guess that on your own. And you can't really visually observe that any other. Okay, is there anything else? Okay. All right, well, so we're about to get into the fun stuff, but does anyone need a break? Does anyone need to run the bathroom or anything? We'll just keep going. Okay, let's do it. All right, here we go. So now you have the stuff that you think you're going to need. Now we got to find the lake. So a few things to consider here is the time of year. That's going to be pretty important because that's going to tell you what bugs you might expect. And if there's certain species that are affected by seasonal spawning, that can also dictate where you're going to go. If it's May and you're fishing a Stillwater where there's a lot of rainbows and cutthroat, you're definitely going to want to go near some sort of inlet. Fishing reports and stocking reports, those are also great. A lot of these lakes that you want to fish are pretty popular, and Sportsman's or someplace like that is going to have a good, reliable online or either in-store stocking report. Call local fly shops, they'll tell you. I generally find people are a lot more loose-lipped with lakes than they are with rivers. So you can get a lot of good information from people. And then this last one, we're going to jump into this here next. This is the trophic status of the lake. So what the trophic status is how productive the lake is, how many different types of bug species are present, basically. That is going to give you a key indicator of what type of fish you can expect, how many fish you can expect, and what bugs you can expect. Also, it can give you an indicator if there's may be winter kill. There's a lot of vegetation. The lake is highly productive. A long winter, that vegetation will decay. It will consume oxygen, and a lot of times that will lead to some sort of significant amount of winter kill. Even maybe the entire lake dying.
Oh, yeah.
How do you find that out?
Well, so you can kind of guess, but you could go online and see if the state agency has that report, like Utah.gov, Idaho Fish and Game or whatever. You can find reports on these lakes, and it will list it in its classifications or whatever. And again, we have a slide here that's going to break that down a little bit more. Okay, we found the lake we want to go to. Now we're going to do a little bit of homework to find these different zones. This is not showing up really well up there, so I'll just have to kind of describe it to you. But there's three main zones we're going to consider: the shoreline, the deep water zones, and then the area in between, which is going to be the shoal area. I break this down a lot like a hunter would, where you got your bedding areas and you got your feeding areas, and they're going to have their preferred trails to get from one to the other. They don't like to live necessarily where all the food is most of the time because they're a little bit too exposed there. Sometimes you can go target them in where they like to live or in their bedding zone, but a lot of the times you're going to want to kind of intercept them. Okay, so once we're out on the lake, you kind of have an understanding of what's going to happen out there. We're going to get serious about finding the fish. Trial and error, you can always do that. You can just go out, go on a limb. But if you really want to take the best advantage of your time, I found that you want to focus on these things. So first of all, oxygen, because fish cannot go anywhere where there's not oxygen. They don't have to be where the food is, because they can just not be eating, but if their oxygen isn't there, they won't be there. A lot of you have probably heard that magic temperature range, 50 to 65 degrees. That is because colder water holds more dissolved oxygen, and that happens to be the temperature where most bugs are hatching. So that's kind of why you want to aim for that zone. Some sources of oxygen to consider in a lake: tributaries, vegetation, and wind action. Those are really the three main things that oxygenate a lake: the water coming in, the plants photosynthesizing, and the wind hitting the surface and stirring it up, interacting, getting that oxygen in there. There is some seasonal fluctuation as far as oxygen goes. Stratification of lakes is a big one, which is what we're going to talk about now. This can be a little bit complex as a subject, but when you break it down, it's really not that bad. You don't necessarily have to understand why this is happening. You just have to understand that it is happening and how that's going to affect the fish. Stratification, it occurs in the warmest and the coldest months. The whole premise behind this, the driving factor, is that colder water is more dense and it sinks, warmer water is less dense and it rises. Well, kind of, most of the time. So it's kind of unique. So let's start with winter. You got an ice-capped lake. Here, the warmer water is actually on the bottom. It's because of that magic number, 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That is when water is at its most dense. As it gets colder, it becomes less dense. That's why ice floats on top. If that phenomenon didn't happen, then life on Earth wouldn't even exist. So during that time, they will be a little bit deeper because they like that warmer water where 39 degrees, you can still have some midge hatches, you can still have scuds moving around and stuff like that. Okay, now the ice is coming off. What's unique about ice off is that stratification will actually persist until late spring, maybe even early summer. Those fish, the water is cold enough, they can go into the shallowest areas that they're going to be able to access all year when that ice is receding. That 5 feet or less of water, it's gonna warm up faster than anywhere else, and bugs are going to start hatching there. These are going to start moving. So fish will cruise those zones almost exclusively. Plus, they have the nearby added protection of that receding ice line. So if anything happens, they get spooked, they can just dart right back under. So if you're going there during those ice-off periods, that you want to find ice-off conditions, but generally it's better if they have some of those expansive shallow areas nearby to that ice-off conditions, not just rocky ledges.
That's not where fishing is coming.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is like you can go out and have the best fishing day you've ever had, and then you could go out the next day, same conditions, and just may not show up. But that's fishing, right?
Every time you feel like I thought. Throw the fly on the ice and bring it and then drop it down.
Yeah, and the method I've heard with that is that
Never done it.
bugs will get encapsulated in that frozen water, and as it melts, they kind of start raining down, so they might cruise those. I can see that happening. I don't know if that's the main driving factor, but I can see that happening. Okay, so now we're towards the end of spring. The surface temperature has warmed up significantly, and it's going to get to the point where it's now at that 4 degrees Celsius range. So these two areas are going to start to mix. Wind action on the surface kind of is a catalyst for that event. Things will start what we call turning over. Turnover is a notoriously awful time to fish. I'm being serious. Things are kind of mixed up. You'll see murky water, maybe a lot of floating algae or something. The fish are kind of unsettled during that time, just like the water. Generally, got to let it kind of chill out for a week or so, and then the fishing will get good again.
And it doesn't happen all at once on all the lakes. It
Mm-hmm.
can progress.
Yep.
What are they feeding on?
I expect whatever they can. They're probably opportunistic. If they might go towards the river inlets more, if there are those present. But it's not unlike when a river gets blown out and the fish, I think they can afford to shut down their metabolism and not eat during that time. Or I'm sure if something presents itself, they will, but they're just uneasy, I guess. Again, these are kind of all my interpretation of what's going on, other people's interpretation. I have a good buddy who we were in the boat one day and he, I said something about, well, the fish are doing this and we're going to try this. And he just kind of jokingly said, did the fish tell you that? And it always stuck in my mind. I always kind of, everything I say in the back of my mind, I always follow it up with that. This is our best guess at what's going on. So I guess the gist of that is try whatever you think and it may work for you. Okay, so now in the summer months, I always think of Flaming Gorge when it comes to stratification, just because lake trout, kokanee, that's what, and big body of waters, those all contribute to good stratification fishing. The colder waters down below, and this it's called the hypolumian or something. I don't really care for what words are up there, but the area in between, that's what you're going to call your thermocline. That's where the warmer water on top and the colder water below is mixing. You'll notice this is kind of like a conveyor belt. So the wind is hitting the surface, the water is moving in like that. Water is actually, the way it stacks from a chemistry standpoint is in thin layers and thin sheets. So that counterclockwise motion up top is going to trigger a clockwise motion on the bottom. That middle layer is going to get constantly replenished with oxygen from above and food from above and food from below if there is any food present. So fish like kokanee that rely pretty much solely on like zooplankton and things like that, they're going to live exclusively in that zone during that time of year. Predatory fish that feed on those bait fish are going to target those zones almost exclusively at that time of year. So depending on the fish species you're fishing, you're going to need to know where that thermocline is occurring. It's going to be in different parts of the lake or different levels at different parts of the lake. It's also going to change as the contour of the lake bottom changes. You'll see as the lake starts to rise, the thermocline will kind of too. So again, sounders can help you identify that. Even if you can't see the thermocline on a sounder, you can probably see bait balls. You might see algae down there. You might see the larger fish in that area. So again, just something to consider. This tends to occur on this type of scale more in larger bodies of water and also lower elevation. So if you're fishing mid to high elevation lakes, most of the time they're not going to experience this stratification to a degree where it's really going to affect their fishing method. The fish kind of have the luxury of going anywhere in the water column and having what they need. Then turnover will occur again mid to late autumn. Again, kind of gets unsettled. Things aren't great during that time, but right after that cold and now oxygenated water is on the surface, fish can cruise into the shallows where the food is. That's why late fall is such an awesome time for fishing from a Stillwater standpoint. Unfortunately, it just seems to last for 2 weeks is all. But there you go. Okay, that's kind of our deep dive into stratification and what that means for us. Okay, we know where the oxygen is going to be. At least we have a good idea. So now we got to find oxygen. We also got to find food in that oxygen. Again, they don't need food all the time, but they do need that oxygen all the time. What food sources are present is going to be determined on a daily cycle. It can be determined on a seasonal cycle, but mostly it's going to be determined by what we talked about a little bit prior, is that trophic status of the lake. So this is going to bring us to that slide I was referring to. This is this is the TSI, or Trophic Status Index. It's a scale from 0 to 110, the low end of that scale being an unproductive lake, the high end of that scale being productive or even hyperproductive. So what an unproductive lake means is that lake, the reason it's unproductive is because it's going to have a much higher deep water area, or a ratio of deep water to shallow water. So there's little areas where plants can grow and then where macroinvertebrates can grow. The water there is very clear. There's a low nutrient density, so there's not different types of bugs. What that means is fish in these waters that are going to prey primarily on other fish or terrestrial insects. In the middle, semi-productive mesotrophic lakes. This is what I like the most because you have those deep water zones. You have the shoal areas, there's still good clarity, and the fish are going to be mostly feeding on those macroinvertebrates. That's really nice for us as anglers because we can predict those feeding habits almost down to a science. We can take advantage of that. Then on the high end, we got our ultra productive lakes. They're usually all vegetated, highly vegetated, poor clarity, algal blooms. I always think of like Hobbs Reservoir or something like, and where you're worried to go in there, you might get like a flesh-eating bacteria or something. You might do good with some warm water species, but trout, you're not going to want to go there for trout. There may be some exceptions. Generally, I like to stick to the upper two portions here. So now let's visualize this. So on the low end, those productive lake, I always think of like my headwaters that we went to, those ultra clear lakes right at the head basins where they're just kind of big buckets. There's limited shoreline. There's almost no plant growth in there. Dry flies can be such a good tactic there because they're pretty much always looking up. You get low recruitment in these lakes because predation is so high. So a lot of those fry don't make it to maturity. So what that means is less competition for the big fish. So you'll catch typically not a lot of fish, but the ones you will catch will be pretty big, at least for their environment. So you're going more for quality, not quantity here. In the middle there, again, the ones I really like, you're going to get high recruitment because they're not being preyed on as much. And there's plenty of food to go around. Competition isn't as much of a factor. And with all that high food, there's high quantity of fish, but there's also generally a lot of quality of fish. Kind of the interesting thing there is the different age classes or sizes of fish, they'll tend to congregate together. So you may be in an area where you're catching tons of fish and they're in a 8 to 10, 12-inch range, versus you could move to another area, maybe catch less, and those are all where all the big boys are. These areas, they can become highly vegetated, and if they're at a high enough elevation, they're snow-capped long enough, may experience winter kill. Boulder Mountains, mid-elevation, those are all ones that they're notorious for being so cyclical. People will say we were catching 4 or 5 pound trout out of there or whatever last year, and then you could show up and there's no fish, or you might even see the bottom littered with dead fish. I see that a lot on some of my favorite lakes. There's usually high stocking in these areas, so you can rely on those state agency stocking reports. That was a good idea. A little pro tip with those though, if they did have winter holdover or a chance of it, you want to get there before they stock them, because those big fish are going to be swimming around, and you're not going to have to weed through all those little stalkers to get to them. And when it's capped over during the winter, there's still so many scuds and midges and leeches and damsels swimming around that those fish just feed nonstop. And that's actually when it seems they'll do their most growing, is during those winter months. Then again, there's your low elevation lakes. They struggle there, the fish do. There's not really any spawning habitat, and it's just not good oxygen conditions, especially if there's algae blooms. Okay, this is the fun stuff. This is what I was looking forward to the most. Macroinvertebrates. The reason these are so nice is because they're always present in the lake to a degree, because they typically all have a full life cycle, so like an egg, a larva, a pupal, and an adult stage. They are keystone species. So that means the presence of these gives direct correlation to the overall health of the ecosystem there. So certain bugs, mayflies, caddis, stoneflies, or whatever, they are non-pollution. They cannot tolerate pollution at all. So you know that we got some good healthy water there. But then on the flip side, the good news is that things like chironomids or midges or leeches and scuds, they are pretty pollutant tolerant. So you can have some lakes with that higher productivity and they can thrive in there. So for the purposes of this, rather than diving into all of those, we're going to focus solely on the chironomids in this discussion. But if any of you want to chime in with any other bug species that you found success with on lakes, please do so. You could just dive into each of these in such detail that it would take forever. Okay, so before I go on to the next slide, where we're going to talk more about chironomids, let me point out the life cycles here. So you have your adult, it's going to lay an egg mass on the water. That egg mass is going to sink towards the bottom, and then it's going to hatch. And it will do that shortly after reaching the bottom, sometimes even before the bottom. Then the larval stage is broken up into what are called instars. Instars are basically stages between molting cycles. So they will remain a larva and they will shed their cuticle or exoskeleton multiple times. Depending on the species, they may do it up to 3 times and have 4 instars. Another thing I forgot to mention about midges, they are the most diverse aquatic insect and macroinvertebrate in the world. There's over 2,500 species and they're discovering more all the time. And they're present to a degree in every single body of water. Okay, that's all I really wanted to mention about that, and we'll move on to this a little more detail, a little easier to visualize for our purposes. Okay, so we've got that egg mass sinking. Now, as far as I know, there's no evidence to really suggest that the fish are targeting egg mass. Even if they would, it would be like trying to fish them with zooplankton, which could be effective. The only downside is they don't congregate like zooplankton. They're microscopic. But when they hatch and they become those larvae, that is a really good time to try to target them. What these larvae do is during that first instar, they are free floating. They're moving around with the current, they're swimming around, they're very vulnerable, they're pretty small. Towards the end of that, they will form a tube in the bottom substrate. That can be anywhere from 5 to 105 feet of water. They can live in an extremely diverse range of depths. And they will anchor themselves in there. They'll poke their little head out and they'll feed on passing decaying matter, detritus, whatever, while they go through the rest of those instar cycles. Now, towards the end of their final instar, they will seal themselves in that tube and kind of like a little cocoon, and they'll then commence the transformation into a pupa. Once that so it can be, they can live in the larval stage for generally up to a year. Again, some of them will do it within a matter of weeks or months. Those are typically your smaller midges. But in these productive lakes, there's going to be so many different varieties of midges all at once that you can count on some sort of hatch occurring every day, pretty much every day of the year, from ice off to ice on, which is, again, another reason why we love it. Now that they will, from the time they seal themselves into the tube and become the pupa, it's going to be dependent. They actually will stay in that dormant stage until oxygen conditions are ideal. The pupa has much higher oxygen requirements than the larval stage does. The larva has built-in hemoglobin with pretty much all the oxygen that's going to need for its whole life cycle. Now, once conditions are right, again, it's usually that once you get to like the 40s, mid 40 degree range, that's when we'll start to see these midges hatching. That tends to coincide with the spring season. So spring season is generally known as the chironomid pupa season. Although, like I mentioned, they are all hatching year round. They will emerge from that tube, and they will stage within the first 10 to 12 inches above the surface, and they'll stay there for days, maybe even weeks. They're referred to as a dull chironomid in this stage. They have a very dull appearance. They're pretty much just black, slender, carrot-shaped things. They're very vulnerable during this time. They're not moving much. That is kind of why it seems they've taken on that dull form, is so that they can blend in a little bit better. Now they will before they start to, or as they start to commence their final metamorphosis into the adult midge or adult chironomid, they will, through gas exchange, build up CO2 underneath their cuticle or underneath their exoskeleton, and that gives them a very silvery look. And they're called chromies at that point. That's what these ones over here are. That coincides with when they're going to start shedding that outer cuticle and become the adult, and it also coincides with when they're going to start wiggling up to the surface. That gas helps them become more buoyant. From the time they start moving till they reach the surface is a matter of seconds, even in deep water. They're moving very quickly. I think they're so vulnerable at this point because they're so highly visible to the trout that through evolution, the ones that move the fastest are the ones that survive. From the time they reach the surface till they fly away as a full adult is about 5 seconds generally. So again, we think, why is it so hard to catch them at drought? Well, I mean, it doesn't happen that often. In the whole year that they've been a thing, that 5 seconds is just a blip. And also the fish have so much going on below the surface. A lot of the times, even if you see the top boiling, they're eating those emergers or those rising. But anyway, it can still be very effective. Don't get me wrong. We still do it a lot, but we have other methods that can be generally more effective. For me, what this means, I like to target these hatches right during this stage. They're starting to gas up, and some of them may be rising to the surface. One reason is you have evidence of that. You'll see shucks on the water surface. You'll be able to see them in the throat sample. I think the biggest reason it's so effective at this time is the fish are so used to cruising the bottom, looking for these dole midges, because they've been there for days or weeks, that they're already in that habit. Maybe a certain time of day they go out and they're not even thinking about it, but now they have these big glowing neon signs of these chromies broadcasting their presence, and fish will move yards, or you wouldn't believe how far they'll move for a chromie pattern, because they're already down there. They're saying, oh, there's one right there, and if I wait too long, it's going to move to the surface. So when I'm fishing these, I'll generally put on my bottom fly. Maybe I'll leave it as a dull midge. Sometimes they like those better. And then spaced out evenly throughout the rest of my leader system up towards the surface, I'll put on those chromies. 1, maybe 2, depending on the depth, maybe 3 more patterns. At some point, you gotta realize I'm kind of limited by my own skills. I don't want to be casting 5 flies, but you'll try, you will, and you'll probably fail, but it's still fun. Okay. All right, here's a throat sample I took. I like this throat sample a lot because it shows some of these dole midges. Now, these dole midges, they were dead, they were no longer living. And these larvae, there's multiple instars represented here. There's some that may be in their first or second, and there's some that are going to be filling themselves any minute. These can be 1.5 inches long. They're just giant morsels. I happened to catch this fish during my favorite time to fish larval patterns. Shallow water, high winds, stirring up enough sediment to make things murky. What that's doing is it's flushing them out of their tubes that they've been living in. They don't want to leave them, obviously, but if the wind action is enough to stir up that bottom, they don't really have a choice. The fish will come in, the fish feels safer with that little bit of off-colored water, and they're looking for those bright red things. And if you throw anything red in there, it can be pretty vicious. A couple of patterns I have there that I really like. Something weighted if you need to, something unweighted to look a little more natural, and something very attractor-based, especially for those really off-color conditions. Just bigger, they can see it from further away. Indicators, thinking lines, intermediate lines, it all works. You're gonna dictate that based on the conditions, not necessarily on the pattern you're imitating.
What time of year did you take that?
This was fall.
Good.
I mean, I kind of suspect that when the pupa action dies down a little bit, they might transition over to these more. But I think the driving factor is when they're available. They're not always easy. You'll see fish swim along with their nose in the sand, picking them out of their holes. But generally, they're going to wait till some sort of event has flushed them from their home, or if they have nothing else to feed on, I guess. But if you're getting a throat sample like this, generally they're in there specifically targeted. Okay, this throat sample came from the same fish in the same pump. Why I like this is because it shows that there was adult pupa and there's also a gas fed pupa. And during that time, I was fishing adult pupa and gas fed pupa, and they were both alive. Um, they were both about the same size. I expect they were the same species. Just kind of cool to see that. You will get a lot more dramatic as far as chromies go than that. Like you'll pull them out and it looks like someone has the shiny side of aluminum foil wrapped around something. See. Okay, so we got food. We know where there's oxygen. Now we're just missing the fish. One thing that's going to drive that is the presence of structure, what the fish are going to feel safe around, because they're not going to go out into 5 feet of water if it's hundreds of yards across and there's no vegetation. Birds of prey are their number one factor out there, so they're going to try to avoid that at all costs. There needs to be something nearby in order for them to feel safe. These 3 things we've talked about so far, keep in mind, they will fluctuate seasonally as well as daily. Types of structure in a lake. I've listed these in order of importance as far as I'm concerned. Number 1 being the contour of the lake, because that's going to be present on whatever body of water you're on, even if it's just a sandy bottom. Again, I come back to Pyramid Lake. There's 3 types of structure out there: sand, rocks, and sand. That's all there is. But there's those drop-off zones. Fish feel comfortable cruising there because they have access to that deeper water. Another reason they like that is any sort of structure that stands out, their prey is also going to be naturally attracted to that because it provides some sort of protection so they can ambush prey. If you don't have a sounder or a bathymetric map, the next best way to understand what's going on beneath the surface is by observing the topography around you, what's above surface. You just got to imagine those ridges, those valleys, those cliffs, those meadows extending out into the lake and where they already are, because they most likely are. That's going to give you a really good idea of areas where fish might be close to feeding area but have some structure nearby. Weeds or woody debris, these are probably top. Like this is what you want to focus on the most, because not only is the food in there, because that's where the oxygen is, that's where the macroinvertebrates live, but certain types of weeds or fallen logs or beaver dams will provide that protection from above. So they can spend a lot more time there than they normally would. Obviously, the trouble there is figuring out a way to effectively fish it without getting snagged a bunch. Riffles and cloud cover is often overlooked. Riffles on the surface of the water cast a lot of shadows. Think about the bottom of a swimming pool when people are splashing up above, all those ripples going on. It can be significant enough to actually drop the temperature below those zones to a more habitable range for the fish. And again, it breaks up they know they're less visible. They just feel more protected in those shadowy areas. So they tend to be a little bit more active when there's cloud cover, when there's riffles. They're just more likely to be a little bit more daring during those times. Algae is another uncommon one people don't know a lot about. The main reason being is these algae blooms, which are fed on by zooplankton, and then the fish feed on the zooplankton and other things. These algae blooms typically occur about 10 feet down or even more. So you probably can't see them from the surface, but you can mark them on your sounder. You'll see that big cloud below, and then you can even see fish below it. They will block out a lot of sun, so fish will kind of follow during those warmer periods. It can be very effective. Okay. Oh, I put this on here to kind of point out some things as far as structure goes. So again, our deep water areas over here, our shallow areas here, some fallen logs. There's even a beaver dam over here. All good things that if I saw this from a map, I would start to like maybe drop some waypoints in places I want to check out. Even if it looks seemingly flat, there could be depressions in the ground that may only be 10 or 12 inches deeper than what's around them, but it's better than nothing. The fish are going to feel more comfortable there. That they'll kind of trigger or follow those as travel corridors, I guess you could say. And I happen to know that in these pictures, there's 3 different types of vegetation going on. Lining this big drop off to this big deep water, there's vegetation that anchors in the ground about 10 feet down and grows in big long stalks all the way to the top and sits on top of the surface water. Then in these areas, there's places where the whole bottom is kind of carpeted in some sort of fuzzy vegetation. And then there's areas where that's broken up into a model bottom. These marl areas are really good because you can fish sinking lines, you can get your flies right down, you're not worried about snagging, and you can spot the fish a lot better, so it's a great spot for sight fishing. These vegetated areas where it's carpeted on the bottom are also another great spot to trigger. Something I'll show you a diagram about a little more is using those tall weeds to your advantage. Anchoring on one side of them and targeting the fish that are on the other side. You can move in really close and they won't be alerted to your presence because you've kind of blocked that line of sight. Now you will be challenged with the task of getting fish over or even through those weeds, but it's not too hard. It can be a really good tactic to move in close. Okay, we found the fish. We found what they like. They're here. Now, this is where the magic of stillwater fishing really comes into play, is your ability to key in on these fish. Once you've found them, if you do some things, you're likely to spend the day catching a lot of fish. So you might, at this point, have already caught a fish, and it will maybe be a fish that's of an appropriate size range to use a throat sample. Generally, I try to stick to like 14 inches or more. I don't know. I don't know if there's any science behind that. I just feel where I got it. So what you're going to do is you're going to get your vial ready, whatever that may be. And I fill the vial with clear water. If there's murky water on one side of the boat, I'll go to the other, get the clearest water I can in this vial because you don't want your sample to be obstructed by murky water. I press the bolt. Okay, so I suck it out. Sorry, I'm kind of going through it in my head what I'm doing. All right, you suck the water out in the bulb. You squeeze the bulb while it's up like this, and so the water's still in here. You don't want to squeeze it like this and shoot all that water out. Now you insert it into the fish's throat, and you just barely put it in there, probably only 2 or 3 inches. And what you'll feel is the first sign of resistance. That is the fish's throat muscles having a reflex to tighten around whatever is there, to not let it swim back out if it's a food item. That has formed a seal on the end, and you know you have it right if you let go and it stays compressed. At that point, you slowly slide it out and you'll hear it, and you'll likely see some blobs shoot back up in there. Then I'll turn it back up this way. I'll kind of swish it around because I have that water in there. It's gonna get all of that into the water and ready to squirt back into the vial. And then I have my sample to do, let the fish go, do its thing, observe your sample. Again, not only is it extremely effective to target the exact size that they're feeding on, the exact color, the exact life stage, but it's just really cool to see what's going on. You can even take these home and switch it out with isopropyl and preserve your sample and put it on your fly tying desk and try to mimic it later. It's just a whole other thing to get into. That's kind of what fishing is about for me, is finding little things to obsess over. Okay, but moving on. Sample. Okay, this is kind of my spin-off of Phil Rowley, who's kind of the godfather of fishing. He has this process that he calls DRP. I call it systematic variation, but it's really the same thing. You're taking the variables that you can control while fishing, and you're figuring out a way to change those variables in a repeatable and efficient manner to key in on what those fish are doing as fast as possible. So what DRP means is depth retrieve patterns. You're going to be changing the depth. You may have a good idea of where they are already, but every cast, basically, I'm switching up my depth to a degree until I have success. Not only that, but I'll be trying different retrieves. As far as retrieves go, you can break that down even further. There's 4 things that you can change to change your retrieve. That's going to be the length of your pull, the speed of your pull, the cadence of your pull or the rhythm, and the pause between the pull. For me, just to keep track of things easier, I like to do an entire retrieve one way. Some people like to switch up their retrieve multiple times throughout, but for me, it's if I hook the fish and I say, oh crap, I can't remember if that was when I was doing fast pulls or if when I had a pause. If I can just keep in my mind, I was just barely crawling it in with my fingers and that's what did it, or I was stripping fast and long, then that's easier for me to repeat. And then once you've tried all those things, that's when you would consider switching your pattern. So you might have an idea of what pattern to use from a throat sample, but even if you don't, and you're kind of just throwing it out there on a whim, generally it's going to be depth or retrieve that affecting if the fish are going to eat it, more so than the pattern. Whatever system you put in place here, it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you stick to it to the point where you can recognize patterns quickly and key in on those fish faster, because you might be getting there on the tail end of a hatch, and by the time you get it figured out, they're moved on to something else. So if you can get this quickly, then you can kind of follow the fish throughout their day, and you can have really good success. One thing I always have to remind myself is if I'm changing something, I have to prove to myself that there's a reason to do it. Sometimes you'll get these things in your mind where like, I just want to throw on this fly because, I just want to throw on this line because, and then you kind of stop yourself and say, well, why are you doing that? And you say, well, I don't know, because when I look around or when I see in the water these conditions, it tells me something else. But I don't know, maybe that's just me, but your brain kind of tries to trick yourself to not trust your senses as much, in my opinion. So just kind of follow up everything you're doing with, why am I doing that? Another thing to consider is you're probably going to be using multiple different lines and rods and reel techniques and lines while you're doing this. So you're going to do the DRP method for every one of those. For everyone you can, at least. From a boat, you might be able to fish 10 different types of lines and rods. From shore, you may be limited to 1 or 2. So once you've exhausted your resources and still no success, that's when it's time to move. Okay, this is the fun part. So we're going to break this down into shore techniques and then boat techniques. And that's where these are going to kind of come into play. So if anyone wants to come and look at them or pass them around again, be my guest. So we're going to start from shore. The number one method most people are going to start with, and it honestly ends up still being the most effective method pretty much all the time, is fishing an indicator from shore. The reason this can be so effective is because the indicator allows you to get your fly far away, and it allows you to keep your fly there. There might be obstructions between you and the fly, whether that's vegetation or rocks, or maybe even just unproductive water that you don't want to have your flies in. You can span over top of that, and then your flies are hanging down in the strike zone. It also allows you to key in on a specific depth, perhaps better than any other method, because you know that depth, your indicator is staying in that zone, and you know exactly how long your flies are. There's not going to be much variation between those two. One tip I would offer about this is if you're kind of unsure and you're just getting started out in that location you're fishing, start with your flies spaced 3 to 5 feet apart. We typically space our flies a lot further apart on lakes than we do on rivers, just because the depth zones and the feeding zones are that much more vast.
One tip that I found helpful when using this slip indicator is if you look at regular bait fishermen and the indicator stops,
Yeah,
bobber stops, put one of those just above your slip indicator at whatever height you're at. Then when your indicator pops and drops, you still know where that height was that you had it at.
Yep.
To reset.
And they go through your guides, no problem. You'll strip them in and you'll just more hear them and then you'll throw them. Great tip. Also, when they're spaced out, I'll try different bug imitations. Even if I think or know they're fishing on midges, I'll try 2 different things. If you're gonna do that, different flies, I like to keep in mind where that bug that I'm imitating with that fly is likely to be. If I'm putting on a midge pattern, you better believe I'm putting it on that bottom fly. A lot of the time people get it in their mind that they want their heaviest fly on bottom. That's for ease of casting, but I mean, you're already kind of having to become a casting aficionado if you're fishing a long line with multiple flies anyways. Doesn't make that much of a difference. And then if you have a bait fish or a leech or something, they typically like to ambush those from below because they can see them better when they're above them, so they let it against the sky. So in my mind, that just makes sense. Have your midge on the bottom, your leech on top. Something like that, even if it's just to give you more confidence in what you're doing. In my mind, that's a valid reason to do something like that. Once you've found that the fish are consistently taking one fly over the other, then you can put your fly closer together, 1 or 2 feet apart, and you may even switch to 2 of the exact same fly if they're taking that. Generally, I like to keep one of my flies in a tracker pattern. A lot of people have that thought that that's what's luring them in because they can see it from further away. Then once they're there, kind of seeing what's going on, they recognize the midge or whatever as, oh, that's food. I know that's food. I'm going to take that. I mean, I think that's true. But there may be times where putting on 2 of the exact same fly ends up being the most effective. Okay, now here's your sink tip method from shore. Again, what this is allowing you to do is it's allowing you to span that distance between you and the fish, but the sink tip is allowing you to do a faster retrieve. We're still doing retrieves with bobbers a lot of the time. We were almost never letting them sit still. Either the wind or the chop is moving them, or you're doing twitches, or you're crawling them in. But if you want to do fast retrieves with like bait fish patterns or something, you need that sink tip because that's going to give you enough weight so that when you strip fast, friction isn't going to cause your flies to fly up towards the water surface. With this method, for me, the time where I get most of my takes is actually on the fall. So if you're going to fish this, what I would do if I was you is you're going to cast those flies out there, and as soon as they land, strip in all of your slack until everything becomes tight, and then you're just going to sit there and let it sink. 10, 20, 30 seconds or whatever. Pay attention to that color change between your floating running line and your sink tip, because you'll actually see it either move, twitch, or even pause, and that's most likely a fish. And then another thing I would say is two reasons here behind this. So we're going to fish what we call the hang in this method. What the hang is at the end of your retrieve, when you have like 10 or 20 feet of line out still, you're going to reach out, taking advantage of that long rod we're using, all the way out from you, hold your line parallel to the water surface, and you're going to raise straight up about that fast. That's called fishing the hang. And there's been times where that's the only way I've caught fish all day, and I've consistently caught them on that. Not only is that saying, triggering to the fish, like, oh, this thing might get away, let's hit it now, but that's also keeping you off of those rocks or weeds or whatever that are close to you as a short angler. Whether I'm using sink tip or a sinking line, I'm generally always fishing the hang, even if it's from shore or from a boat. It's just a good idea to try. Okay, now there are times where I'll use a full sinking line from shore. Generally, this is times where I have a shallow, preferably sandy, gently sloping shore or bottom out away from me. There's this one particular point on Lost Creek. I don't know why this happens, but every spring around the same time, I'll go there and I'll fish this method with a buoyant white woolly bugger, and I'll catch all day flake. That's the only time of year I can catch flake out of it. But whatever it is, what this method does really well is it allows you to fish those flies right near the bottom without getting hung up because you have that slightly buoyant fly. But as that contour slowly changes and you're getting shallower and shallower, it's still staying within 10 inches or so of the bottom because of the sinking line. The sinking line is probably sitting right in the sand. In fact, I'll make it sit in the sand. I'll cast out, I'll strip everything in until it's straight, and I'll give it enough time that I know it's sitting right there on the bottom. Pyramid Lake's another place where people do this a lot because there's those big, long, sandy beaches. Fish are cruising through all day. You're covering a lot of ground, and you're just staying right in that strike zone. One tip I can offer with this is it's not always best to cast perfectly perpendicular to shore. Let's say you're noticing the fish are consistently hitting the fly when they're about 20 feet away from you. Well, now if you quarter this way, you've just extended the amount of time you're fishing that 5-foot depth range or whatever it may be. You maybe now you're doubling that because rather than covering it for the short period of time on a perfectly perpendicular retrieve, you're now more parallel and it's just running through that more often. Sometimes I'll go perfectly parallel to shore and just cast this way. At Pyramid Lake, there's been plenty of times where I've turned around and cast to shore. I'm on my ladder and no one's having left out towards shore, but there's 100 yards of water between us and shore, and the fishermen for some reason back there. Whatever it is, it's a very variable method that you can fish changing bottoms as long as there's not rocks or sticks or plants that you're going to get hung up on. Okay, boat techniques. So for boat techniques, most of the time, we're going to be double anchored. Double anchoring is crucial because you're going to drop one off the stern, one off the bow, and that's going to keep you from moving side to side as wind changes or whatever. Especially if you have two anglers, then you both are casting to where you want to be fishing. And you're not having to pick up line and cast over each other. So again, here we're using our indicator method. One of my favorite ways to do this is to pull up adjacent to a shoal area, anchor in the deep water. If I have some tall weeds between me and the fish, even better, because again, it's masked my presence. But it could very well be the other way around. You might want to anchor in the shallow and target the fish that are in the deep sections. Whatever it may be, it's a really good method. When it comes to these tall weeds, it sounds a little daunting, but just up your tippet size a little bit. So if we do go through the weeds, you can pull them through there easy. B, there's about a 3 to 5 second window right after you hook the fish where you can kind of take advantage of them, exploit them. And if you horse them during those first few seconds, they'll get to the top of the water and you can tell walking right over those weeds over to you. You'd be surprised how effective that is. If you do that, you'll hardly ever have them dive back into those weeds. But if they do, you'll be glad that you upped your tippet size a little bit. Okay, we're to this hovering line technique now. I really like this hovering line technique for fishing those shallow areas where they might be targeting damsels or dragons or scuds or something that are moving faster and more erratically than what I can mimic with a floating line and an indicator. Not only that, but if there is some vegetation on the bottom, like maybe the vegetation line is a foot or two above the bottom, with that hover line, I can get very, very specific with my depth. If I know it's sinking at 1.5 inches per second, I can just count down until I'm right at the 3 feet or 5 feet or whatever I want. And then as soon as I start stripping, that sink is going to stop. Nice thing with the hover intermediate lines is even if that retrieve is just a little finger crawl, it's still stopping that descent. One tip I could offer with this is use some sort of slightly buoyant scud. Like there's a scud over here that I tied a little bit of orange foam into the top, and that is my point fly. Everything else in between is either slightly weighted or unweighted to a degree. So that's going to keep everything up on this end. We're keeping it up on this end, and you're fishing that washing line technique. You can fish it as fast or as slow as you'd like. Another reason you might want to consider switching to this type of line is sinking lines. They're thinner, they're denser, they cast a lot better. This is also, use this out in open water too. Fish, for whatever reason, I feel like fish generally are feeding within the bottom 3 feet of the water or the top 3 feet of the water. So you could be out in 100 feet of water and they're still in that top range. Hopper dropper is great during that time, dry dropper, but also this method is really good during that time too.
How long is your leader when you run this?
Depends on the fly. If I'm just doing one fly, like if I'm trying to be really stealthy, I might just put on one unweighted scud. That's 3 feet or so. But if I want to have a point fly and 2, maybe even 3 flies between on the walking line, I might be approaching that 8 to 10 foot range. I try to keep it as short as possible. It's just easier to stay in direct contact with everything, especially if you are casting the wind or something. All right, now we're to that parabolic sink. Again, what I really like to do with this line is, let's say the fish are kind of all over. You can't target exactly where they are, or maybe they're not in as one zone specifically. Or you have that drop off away from you and you want to be following that bottom as far as you can. I like to use this most, again, when there's little to no obstructions, because it's just a good opportunity to get your flies right on the bottom. Like if you're fishing a midge larva or something, that you'll generally want those to be kind of bouncing along the bottom because that's where they live. It's a good way to do that. I do like to put a floating fly on the point, like this booby fly with the foam eyes I have, because it helps exaggerate that parabola. If you were to put something with some sort of big tungsten bead on that, you're kind of throwing off your whole technique that you're doing there. It's gonna mess up your flies. You're gonna get snagged. Keep in mind what you're trying to achieve with your fly and how you might be able to help that by how weighted or unweighted your flies are. Open water too, we kind of discussed that earlier, but it's just a good opportunity to cover a lot of the water column in one cast rather than having to make one cast, let it sink for 5 seconds, then on your next cast, 10 seconds, then your next cast, 30 seconds, you kind of achieve all that in one. Okay, this is probably my all-time favorite fishing method out of anything. It's just so fun. It's addictive. What you're going to do is you're going to go out into, it's best in deep water, 20 to 25 feet minimum is what I like. And fish that are on the bottom. What that generally means is the fish are down there either eating those larvae or those dull chironomids. So you might see them on your sounder, just that little bump coming right off the bottom. That's this method right here. This is a 1/10 ounce weighted swivel. And this is a piece of level T shooting head, T14. So it weighs a lot. It's 30 feet long. And then I have running line, monofilament running line behind that. So that all sinks straight below me. And then on the very bottom, I have my midge pattern. Another common food source you'll see out there is zooplankton. So I have my blog pattern that's going to sit up above that off to the side. And you can either, well, so the whole thing with this is you want it to be right in the bottom. So a flat bottom works best. And don't rely on your sounder to tell you exactly what the bottom is, because they can fail. They can be not calibrated correctly. What I do is I actually have a specific weight that I'll use to do this. But before I did that, I would just clamp my hemostats onto this bottom fly and just lower it overboard until I feel that slack occur. Then I position my rod however it's going to be when I'm fishing. If I'm holding it in my hand, I'm going to put it in the same spot with the tip just touching the water surface or whatever. If you have a rod holder, even better. And then you put it in that rod holder, you reel in until you feel that slack go away. Then maybe you reel in again 10, 12 inches just for good measure. At that point, I'll either use a piece of string, like some backing or a marker, and I will mark where my fly line is touching my first cat. So I can return to that depth very easily. Pull everything in, take the hemostats or the weight off, put it back out, and now I'm fishing. If you're holding it in your hand, hold on, do not set it down because they'll rip that thing out of your hand. If you have it in a rod holder, it's really nice because they're going to set the hook on themselves. I had one fish, he must have been coming towards me when he took it. I was fishing in 28, almost 30 feet of water. By the time I saw my rod go down and I realized what was happening, he was already under the boat behind me and airborne, flipping back this way. Came off the fly and launched that way. So he was swimming through like a bat out of hell, caught that fly, and basically rode it like a catapult up and out of the water. That's how aggressive they can be. So that leads me to my tip on this. You'll see that the fish tend to be taking the fly in similar manners. That may be very light, it may be very aggressive like that. If it's very light, you're going to increase your rod angle, so it's pointing more down to where the flies are. So if that's in your hand or your rod holder, doesn't matter, because that's going to hook them better. There's going to be less play in that rod tip. If they're taking it aggressively, raise it closer back to parallel with the rod surface, because now you have that little bit of shock absorption. Even if you're using 10, 12 pound, they can break you off. That smaller fish can break you off pretty easily if you have that straight connection and they take it that aggressively. Okay, anchored is not the only thing you do. Generally, you do want to be controlling your drift to some degree, because then it's just, you can manage yourself better, especially if there's two anglers in the boat. So using a drogue is basically an underwater parachute. I like parabolic drogues, so they're kind of a square that opens in a parabola. They do have conical drogues. There are certain benefits and drawbacks to each. But what that does is it attaches to your gunnel, one near the stern, one near the bow, and it inflates in the water behind you. So it's best to do this when there is some sort of breeze. Because as you're going, this will catch and it will fill up and it will hold you perfectly perpendicular to the way the wind is blowing. And the benefit of that is you're covering a lot of water, you're covering different types of water, and you're always presenting your flies to new fish. It's basically fishing a drift boat on a river in a lake setting. Then this kind of puts it into perspective. Again, it's kind of dull, but this gives you the top view. So our wind is blowing this way. If you can see the arrows, the drogue is also moving this way. You can set up your drift to cover a specific area if you want, or if you don't know where to fish, start at the end of the lake the wind's coming from, and just start drifting the whole lake. If you tap fish, drop a little waypoint or make a mental note so you can return there later, perhaps. One thing to keep in mind is, I'll go back to this slide, you can effectively use a drogue through 3 to 5 feet of water. Just be very careful. There's woody debris. You'll get caught. It's very, very difficult to pull yourself back to where that drone is, especially if the wind's blowing hard. Sometimes people have to just cut them and try to get back to them later. Just keep in mind what the obstructions are. If you're just getting into it, I would suggest sticking to open water for a while. Okay, now you can use these to actually steer yourself too. So by lengthening or shortening one of those ropes, and by angling your boat is now gonna keel or track to one direction. So let's say you wanted to follow a specific contour. It's very easy to just pull in some line and loop it around your anchor point to tighten one side. And now, even though the wind's blowing this way, you're kind of going this way. And now there's an obstruction coming up. So now you do it the other way and come this way. And you can follow the shoreline, you can follow the drop off. It's such a deadly method. Almost no one's using this method around here. This is the UK method. It's pretty big in Canada too, but it's just kind of, it's like new technology here, it seems. It's very effective. One thing I have heard is in those places like British Columbia or the UK where lake fishing is the thing they do, there will be certain bodies of water where you anchor in this lake or you drift this lake and they will have names to the drifts, just like famous salmon rivers will have names to the runs. They'll say, oh, we did Daniel's drift today or whatever. And if you're the one idiot anchored and everyone else is drifting, you'll be hassled for sure. I don't see that being an issue around here anytime soon. But it's just kind of something that's interesting. Okay, so now we've kind of covered everything I wanted to talk about. It was a lot. So in summary, what were the things we went over? Number one, well, we need the gear, but then you're going to find the lake, use that trophic status to kind of figure out what you're going to be doing. Once you've found the lake, do your homework. Pull up Google Maps, your hunting maps, whatever it is. Start to mark some points that you want to check out, things of interest. If you're drawn to it, fish are probably drawn to it too. Consider what the oxygenation might be in that lake during that time of year that you're there. And then the food, what type of food's in there. When you get to the lake, look around at some spider webs, walk through the reeds or whatever, gather all the samples you can. Spider webs are good because it's stuff that happened yesterday typically, and you're probably going to experience that sometime here today. So before you even hit the water and have done any sort of sampling in the water, you already kind of have an idea of what to do. The structure, pretty self-explanatory. River anglers, we have no problem recognizing structure. It's just a little bit different process of how we identify it when the whole lake kind of looks the same to us. Then keying in that DRP method, throat samples, how the time of year, the conditions might be affecting that too. Okay, that's it. All right, well, I hope that was somewhat educational for you guys, as interesting as it is to me. Or you just go fishing with Dawson and say, hey, what are you doing? Okay.